A knock in the rain for hours. Rain had drummed a relentless rhythm against Adrian's window, turning the world beyond into a blurred watercolor of streetlights and slick asphalt. Inside, the air was warm, faintly scented with chamomile. Adrian nestled into his favorite armchair, a pool of lamplight illuminating the pages of a worn, leather-bound novel. He traced a line of text, lost in a distant life, a quiet counterpoint to the storm's wild energy. This was his sanctuary, his usual Friday night ritual, undisturbed and peaceful, until a sudden, sharp series of knocks shattered the stillness. Not a gentle tap, but a forceful, urgent cadence vibrating through the floorboards. Adrian flinched, his book nearly slipping. He expected no one. His friends always called. His family knew his routine. The knocking came again, louder, insistent, laced with a desperation that jolted him from literary escape back to the present, a knot of unease tightening his chest. Slowly, he set his book face down on the small table, open pages a silent testament to his interrupted solitude. As he pushed out of the chair, a shiver traced his spine. A premonition, perhaps, or merely the sudden chill of standing. The rain outside seemed to intensify, mocking the sudden vulnerability of his quiet apartment. He approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. The distorted view showed a broad-shouldered figure, illuminated by the porch light, water streaming off a cap. Even through the warped glass, the uniform was unmistakable. A police officer. Adrian's heart gave a strange lurch. He unlocked the deadbolt, its click echoing in the sudden lull between knocks, and pulled the door inward. Mason stood on the porch, rain plastering dark hair to his forehead, his uniform soaked, dark patches blooming across the fabric. His face was pale, drawn tight, a stark contrast to the composed, almost stoic expression Adrian usually saw on patrol. His eyes, typically sharp and clear, were clouded with a deep-seated weariness, a flicker of something raw and exposed. A faint tremor ran through his hands, clenched at his sides. "Mason." Adrian's voice emerged softer than intended, a breathy question. He'd never seen Mason like this, not truly. Mason was a familiar presence, a nod exchanged on the street, a brief wave from his patrol car. This was different. Mason swallowed hard, his gaze darting past Adrian into the warm, lit hallway before settling back on Adrian's face. He looked like a man who had seen too much, carried too much, finally at the edge of his capacity. The usual confident posture was gone, replaced by a subtle slump of his shoulders. "Adrian," he rasped, his voice rough, as if unused for hours. I know this is late and weird, but I didn't know where else to go." His eyes, wide and searching, locked onto Adrian's. Can I just stay for a bit? Just for tonight?" The air between them crackled with unspoken things. The rain continued its steady rhythm, a soundtrack to the abrupt shift in their acquaintance. Adrian saw the desperation in Mason's eyes, a plea that transcended words. He didn't ask what had happened. He didn't need to. The raw emotion etched on Mason's face was explanation enough. Without hesitation, Adrian stepped aside, opening the door wider. "Of course, Mason. Come in. You're soaked." He gestured, a silent invitation to warmth and safety. Mason hesitated for a fraction of a second, as if unsure if the offer was real or if he truly deserved it. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he stepped over the threshold, bringing with him the chill of the night, the smell of damp wool, and something else, a faint metallic tang Adrian couldn't quite place. As Mason entered, the weight of the moment settled heavy in the small entryway. This wasn't just a visit, it was an arrival, a significant shift in the quiet order of Adrian's life. The storm outside had found its way in, not as chaos, but as a silent, vulnerable presence. Adrian closed the door, the click of the lock sealing them inside, away from the turbulent night, together in the unexpected quiet. Silent refuge. The soft click of the lock was the only sound Adrian made as he let Mason in. No questions, no startled exclamation, just the quiet acknowledgement of a man in distress standing on his doorstep again. Mason, still in his uniform, looked like a storm-tossed ship, battered, barely afloat. His eyes, usually sharp and assessing, held a distant, haunted quality. Adrian simply gestured him further inside, a silent invitation to the warmth and stillness of his small apartment. The kitchen light cast a gentle amber glow as Adrian moved with practiced ease. The clinking of ceramic on saucer, the whisper of water heating in the kettle, these mundane sounds were a balm against the raw edge of Mason's anxiety. Adrian poured the steaming concoction into a mug, the scent of chamomile and honey wafting through the air. He placed it on the coffee table before Mason, who had already sunk into the familiar plush of the sofa. Mason didn't reach for the mug immediately. He sat stiff and upright, his gaze fixed on some invisible point across the room. The blue fabric of his uniform seemed too bright, too stark against the muted tones of Adrian's living room. His hands, usually so capable and strong, lay slack on his knees, palms open in a gesture of surrender. He looked utterly drained, a hollowed-out shell of the confident officer Adrian knew. Adrian settled into the armchair opposite him, a comfortable distance between them. He didn't press, didn't try to coax words from the silence. He merely existed, a steady, calm presence in the room. The only sound for long stretches was the soft hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen, and occasionally the distant wail of a siren, a stark reminder of the world Mason had just escaped. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Mason's shoulders began to relax. His gaze dropped from the distant wall to the steaming mug. He picked it up, his fingers curling around the warm ceramic, drawing a faint, shuddery breath. He didn't drink, just held it, a small anchor in the quiet storm within him. Adrian watched him, noting the subtle tremor in his hand, the slight clench of his jaw. He saw not a police officer, but a man profoundly shaken, in desperate need of solace. This was the third night this week. The first time, Mason had been breathless, barely able to articulate his need to just be somewhere safe. Adrian hadn't hesitated, opening his door, his home, without preamble. The second night, the exhaustion had been palpable, a heavy cloak around Mason's shoulders. He'd barely made it to the sofa before falling into a restless sleep. Now, a silent ritual was establishing itself. Mason would appear, sometimes still in uniform, sometimes in civilian clothes, always carrying an invisible burden. Adrian would let him in, make him a warm drink, and offer the quiet sanctuary of his apartment. There was an unspoken understanding blooming between them. No explanations were demanded, no confessions expected. Adrian simply provided the space, the quiet, the unwavering presence Mason seemed to crave. He wondered what horrors Mason encountered on the streets, what darkness he carried home. He didn't ask. He just watched the rise and fall of Mason's chest, the slow unfurling of his tightly wound posture. Tonight, Mason finally took a sip of the tea, the warmth seeming to seep into him, thawing some of the chill. He leaned his head back against the sofa cushions, his eyes closing, a long sigh escaping his lips. It wasn't a sigh of relief, not entirely, but more like the sound of air finally leaving a balloon that had been stretched too taut. Adrian continued to watch, his own heart a steady beat in the stillness. He felt the subtle shift in the room, the tension beginning to dissipate, replaced by a fragile peace. This silent refuge, Adrian knew, was becoming more than just a place to rest. It was becoming a lifeline. Mason, for all his strength and self-reliance, was finding a different kind of strength in Adrian's quiet, unwavering presence. And Adrian, for his part, was discovering a profound sense of purpose in offering it. The night wore on, punctuated only by the soft tick of the grandfather clock in the hall. marking the passage of time in this silent haven. Cracks in the armor, the late-night knocks became a rhythm, not quite predictable, but frequent enough that Adrian found himself leaving the porch light on, a silent invitation in the deepening twilight. Mason would arrive, usually after midnight, his uniform a little rumpled, eyes often shadowed with a weariness that went beyond physical exertion. He never called, never texted. He simply appeared, a spectral figure emerging from the urban night, seeking the quiet refuge Adrian's home offered. Adrian, in turn, never questioned it. He would open the door, a soft understanding in his gaze, and step aside. Mason would stride in, shedding his heavy utility belt and bulletproof vest with a sigh that seemed to deflate him, leaving them in a heap by the coat rack, as if they were burdens he could finally set down. Sometimes they would talk about the mundane hum of Adrian's day, a tricky seam in a new upholstery project, the way the light fell through the living room window in the afternoon. Mason would offer small anecdotes from his shift, sanitized versions of street life, devoid of the grime and the grief. More often, they would simply exist in the same space, the quiet comfort of each other's presence a balm. Adrian might read, the rustle of pages the only sound, while Mason stared into the flickering blue of the television, not truly watching, just letting the ambient noise wash over him. One particularly harsh Tuesday night, Mason arrived earlier than usual, the sky still a bruised purple-black, threatening rain. His knuckles were raw, and his hair, usually neat beneath his cap, was disheveled. He didn't drop his gear by the door tonight. He clutched the vest to his chest as he walked into the living room, his movements stiff, almost robotic. Adrian, who had been sketching, set his charcoal stick down. He didn't need to ask. The air around Mason crackled with a brittle tension. Mason sank onto the sofa, the leather groaning under his weight, the vest still hugged tight. His breath hitched, a ragged sound that tore through the comfortable silence. They found her in the park. His voice was a strained whisper barely audible above the distant city hum. A kid, 10 years old, just left there. Adrian moved, slowly, deliberately, settling beside him. He didn't touch, not yet, just offered his unwavering presence. Mason continued, his voice shaking now, each word a struggle. She looked so small, like a doll someone had forgotten. Her teddy bear was still clutched in her hand, a faded blue one. He closed his eyes, a shudder running through his frame. The parents. I had to tell them. The mother, her scream, it ripped through me. He squeezed his eyes tighter, a tear finally escaping, tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. How do you ever come back from that? How do you keep going back to work, knowing what's out there? He spoke of the sterile crime scene, the muted whispers of his colleagues, the coldness of the forensic gloves, the overwhelming smell of damp earth, and something far more sinister. He spoke of the desperate, hollow ache in his chest, the feeling of utter helplessness that gnawed at him. Adrian listened, his own heart aching in sympathy, a knot forming in his stomach. He saw not just the police officer, but the man underneath, stripped bare of his professional stoicism, raw and vulnerable. When Mason finally fell silent, the only sound was the ragged rasp of his breathing. Adrian reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before gently resting on Mason's arm. The fabric of the uniform was rough against his palm, but beneath it he could feel the tremor in Mason's muscles. He didn't offer platitudes or empty reassurances. He simply squeezed, a silent acknowledgement of the pain, a grounding presence in the storm. Mason leaned into the touch, a barely perceptible shift, but a significant one. The vest, still clutched, loosened its grip. He wasn't just in Adrian's home. He was in Adrian's sanctuary. And in this quiet, understanding space, the armor he wore so diligently had finally begun to crack, revealing the aching vulnerability beneath. For Adrian, holding that fragile space for Mason felt like the most profound purpose he had ever known. Comfort and closeness. The rhythmic tick of the grandfather clock in Adrian's hall was the last thing Mason registered before sleep claimed him. Curled on the sofa, a faded blue throw blanket tucked around his shoulders, he felt a profound sense of release. The tension that had coiled in his muscles for weeks, years even, began to unravel. He hadn't realized how truly exhausted he was until this moment, enveloped by the quiet hum of Adrian's home, a sanctuary from the relentless clang of the city and the echoes of his last call. His breathing deepened, evening out, and the subtle tremor that had plagued his hands since the incident finally stilled. Adrian watched him from the armchair across the room, a book resting unread in his lap. He'd seen Mason's shoulders sag the moment he'd stepped through the door earlier that evening, a visible shedding of the day's burden. It was a familiar ritual now, the way Mason would loosen his tie, rub the back of his neck, and then, almost unconsciously, let out a long, slow breath, as if deflating. The faint lines of stress around his eyes would soften, and the tightly wound energy he carried would dissipate, replaced by a weary calm. Adrian noted the slight twitch of Mason's lips, a barely there smile, as he drifted deeper into sleep, perhaps dreaming of something peaceful, for once. He often found himself observing these small, intimate details. The way Mason's dark hair fell across his forehead, the subtle rise and fall of his chest, the faint scar above his left eyebrow. Each observation cemented the quiet understanding that had grown between them. The next morning, Mason woke to the smell of coffee and the gentle clinking of ceramic from the kitchen. He stretched, feeling an unfamiliar lightness in his limbs. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he hadn't woken up in a cold sweat, haunted by fragmented images. He ran a hand through his hair, the softness of the sofa cushion still against his cheek. Adrian was at the counter, humming tunelessly as he poured 2 mugs. He looked up and offered a small, knowing smile. "Sleep well." "Better than I have in months," Mason admitted, his voice a little raspy. He pushed himself up, feeling a fleeting awkwardness before Adrian's easy demeanor dissolved it. Adrian didn't press, didn't ask for details, just handed him a steaming mug. It was this unspoken acceptance, this quiet offering of refuge, that was slowly chipping away at Mason's guarded exterior. Later that week, back at the precinct, Sarah eyed Mason over the rim of her coffee cup. He was still himself, sharp, focused, a little too serious. But there was a subtle shift in his aura. The rigid tension that usually clung to him like a second skin seemed to have loosened. His shoulders weren't quite as hunched, and the dark circles beneath his eyes, while still present, weren't as pronounced. He even cracked a genuine, albeit brief, smile at something one of the rookies said, a rare occurrence lately. "You look less like you're about to spontaneously combust," Sarah commented dryly, leaning against his desk. Mason glanced up, a faint flush rising on his neck. "Rough night. Good sleep," he mumbled, avoiding her gaze. Sarah, however, wasn't easily deterred. She'd known Mason for too long. "Rough night and good sleep don't usually go together for you, buddy. Something's different." Her eyes narrowed slightly, a glimmer of suspicion, but also a deeper undercurrent of relief. Whatever it was good for him. He seemed a little softer, less like the hardened shell he'd been building around himself. It was a subtle change, almost imperceptible to anyone else. But Sarah knew Mason. She knew the weight he carried, and for the first time in a long time, it looked like some of that weight had been temporarily set down. She wondered what, or who, was providing him that solace. The gentle touch. The city lights, usually a comforting glow, seemed to mock Mason's inner turmoil that evening. He had returned to Adrian's apartment later than usual, the familiar key turning in the lock feeling heavier than ever. The day had been a relentless assault of human depravity, a domestic call gone horribly wrong that had left him shaken to his core. He found Adrian in the living room, a book open on his lap, a mug of steaming tea on the side table. Adrian looked up, his expression unreadable, but Mason felt the quiet understanding in his gaze. Mason tried to speak, to articulate the knot of despair tightening in his chest, but the words caught in his throat. A shudder ran through him, an involuntary tremor that started in his shoulders and spread through his entire frame. He sank onto the edge of the worn armchair, his head falling into his hands. The silence stretched, broken only by the distant hum of traffic and the frantic pounding of his own heart. Then the dam broke. A choked sob escaped him, raw and ragged. It wasn't a gentle weeping, it was a guttural sound, born of accumulated trauma and the sheer exhaustion of always being strong. Tears, hot and stinging, streamed down his face, tracing paths through the grime of the day. He felt utterly exposed, vulnerable in a way he hadn't allowed himself to be in years. He expected judgment, pity, or perhaps even Adrian's quiet retreat. What he received was entirely different. A warmth bloomed on his arm, light and tentative at first, then settling with a gentle pressure. Adrian's hand. It rested just above his elbow, a silent anchor in his tempest. Mason flinched, a sharp, instinctive recoil from the unexpected contact. Physical touch, especially comforting touch, was something he had largely forgone in his adult life, a casualty of his demanding profession and the emotional distance he maintained. For a moment he froze, his breath hitched in his chest. His mind, usually a fortress of logical thought, scrambled to process the sensation. It was firm yet soft, radiating a quiet strength that seeped through the fabric of his uniform shirt. The surprise was profound, a jolt of unexpected connection in his isolated world. He slowly lowered his hands from his face, his tear-filled eyes meeting Adrian's. Adrian's gaze was unwavering, devoid of pity, filled instead with a deep, almost ancient empathy. There was no demand, no expectation, just a steady presence. Mason felt a strange magnetic pull, an inexplicable urge to lean into the warmth, to draw closer to this quiet man who offered solace without a single word. And so he did. Slowly, deliberately, Mason shifted his weight, allowing his arm to relax fully beneath Adrian's hand. He felt the warmth deepen, spreading from his skin outward, chasing away some of the icy chill that had settled in his bones. It was a simple gesture, yet it carried the weight of unspoken understanding, a profound acceptance that bypassed all his carefully constructed defenses. A shaky breath escaped him, and the sobs, though still present, softened, transforming into a quieter, more regular rhythm. Adrian didn't speak, didn't move, just remained there, his hand a steady presence. Mason closed his eyes, allowing himself to be held, to be seen in his brokenness, without needing to explain or justify. The apartment, usually a place of quiet observation, transformed into a sanctuary, the air thick with unspoken comfort. The gentle touch, so unassuming, had bridged a chasm that words never could have. It was a surprising moment of intimacy, a quiet revelation that settled deep within Mason, planting a seed of something new and profoundly unsettling in its potential. He didn't understand it, not fully, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of something akin to hope amidst the desolation, confusion, and retreat. The aroma of Adrian's books, a comforting fusion of aged paper and an elusive woody note, had become as ingrained in Mason's senses as the antiseptic tang of his patrol car. He'd passed countless evenings nestled in the worn armchair, sometimes conversing, often simply existing within the quiet hum of Adrian's presence. This unprecedented serenity, A peace unknown since his sister's death was profoundly unsettling. He'd sought solace, a temporary reprieve from the relentless grind of his job and the gnawing echoes of his past. But what he was discovering here felt deeper, more perilous. One evening, as Adrian read aloud from an ancient, leather-bound volume on celestial navigation, Mason found his gaze drawn to the subtle play of lamplight on Adrian's features. The slight furrow of his brow in concentration, the gentle cadence of his voice. A warmth blossomed within Mason, not merely from the crackling hearth fire, but from a deeper source, an unfamiliar stirring in his chest. It transcended mere comfort. It felt like a fragile happiness, an unearned joy threatening to dismantle the carefully constructed walls around his heart. The realization of this quiet contentment, this unexpected emotional vulnerability with Adrian, a man he'd known only professionally until weeks ago, sent a jolt of panic through him. He rose abruptly, nearly toppling a small side table. I should go, he mumbled, the words feeling foreign and clumsy. Adrian looked up, his expression unreadable, though his eyes held a flicker of concern. Is everything all right, Mason? Yeah, fine. Just tired. He avoided Adrian's gaze, focusing instead on the rug's intricate pattern. A sudden, desperate urge to escape the room, to escape the feeling that had just taken root within him, overwhelmed him. It was too much. He needed distance, needed to recalibrate, to understand why he felt so safe, so inexplicably light in Adrian's presence. He bid a curt good night and practically fled into the cold night air, leaving Adrian standing in the gentle lamp glow, the half-read book still open in his hand. For the next few nights, the familiar thrum of Mason's motorcycle no longer punctuated the quiet of Adrian's street. The porch light remained off, the comforting glow from Adrian's living room window a silent testament to his absence. Adrian found himself pacing more, his gaze repeatedly drifting towards the empty street. He missed the low rumble of Mason's bike, the hesitant knock on the door, the shared silence that had evolved into a cherished ritual. He'd meticulously tidied the already spotless armchair Mason favored, arranged the books on the coffee table just so, as if preparing for a guest who might never materialize. He replayed their last interaction, searching for a misstep, a wrong word, anything to explain Mason's sudden withdrawal. Had he overstepped? Been too open? Too quiet? He'd striven to be nothing but a steady, calm presence, a haven. But perhaps even that was too much for someone as wounded as Mason. A knot of worry tightened in his stomach. He missed Mason's quiet intensity, the way he sometimes leaned forward, listening intently, even when Adrian was only discussing the weather. He missed the subtle shift in the air when Mason finally relaxed, a faint loosening of his perpetually tense shoulders. One morning, Mr. Henderson, Adrian's observant next-door neighbor, stopped him as he retrieved his mail. "Haven't seen your friend's motorcycle around lately, Adrian," he remarked, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp. "Used to be a fixture most nights." Adrian forced a casual shrug. "He's been busy, I suppose. Work." The lie felt brittle on his tongue. Mr. Henderson merely nodded, a knowing glint in his eye before continuing his walk. Later that evening, as darkness fell and the house settled into an unnatural quiet, Adrian found himself staring out the window, a cup of lukewarm tea forgotten in his hand. The silence stretched, heavy and hollow. He worried. He worried about Mason, about whatever he was navigating, and a selfish part of him worried about himself, about the unexpected void Mason's absence had carved. He wondered if he'd simply been a temporary refuge, and now Mason had moved on, leaving Adrian to navigate the quiet ache of his absence alone. The thought was a cold, sharp pang. He hoped, with a desperate sincerity, that Mason would return. The return. The rain had stopped, leaving the asphalt slick and reflecting the streetlights in distorted blurs. Adrian sat on the window seat, the cold glass a familiar comfort against his cheek. 3 days. 3 days since Mason had vanished into the night, leaving behind a silence that was heavier than any words. Adrian had tried not to dwell, to busy himself with paperwork and the quiet hum of his life. But an ache persisted, a phantom limb of Mason's presence. He hadn't realized how much he'd grown accustomed to the late-night knock, the hushed conversations, the way Mason would occupy the space with a quiet intensity. A sudden flash of headlights cut through the gloom, pulling up to the curb. Adrian's heart gave a strange lurch, a mix of apprehension and something akin to relief. The engine cut, plunging the street back into near silence, save for the distant thrum of traffic. Mason emerged from the driver's side, his silhouette stark against the glow of a distant streetlight. He looked different, not just tired, but diminished, as if the last few days had worn away some essential part of him. His shoulders were slumped, and he moved with a hesitant grace, like a man navigating unfamiliar terrain. Adrian pushed himself away from the window, a nervous energy sparking through him. He opened the door before Mason reached it, the soft light from the hallway spilling onto the porch. Mason stopped short, his gaze meeting Adrian's. There was an unfamiliar vulnerability in his eyes, a lost quality Adrian hadn't seen before. Adrian. Mason's voice was raspy, a whisper against the quiet night. He looked around, taking in the familiar porch, the potted ferns Adrian carefully tended. "Can I—" Adrian simply nodded, stepping aside. Mason entered, bringing with him the faint scent of damp wool and something else, a restless exhaustion that seemed to cling to him. He didn't head for the kitchen or the living room, but stood just inside the threshold, his hands shoved into his pockets. "I'm sorry," Mason said, the words barely audible. He wouldn't meet Adrian's gaze directly, instead focusing on a point somewhere over his shoulder. I needed to get away." He paused, then finally looked at Adrian, a flicker of something raw in his eyes. It was loud out there, too many voices, too much. Everything. He took a shallow breath, his chest rising and falling visibly. "I missed this." His hand gestured vaguely around the silent, softly lit hallway. "You're quiet. This place." A wry, self-deprecating smile touched his lips. "And your steady presence." The admission hung in the air, a fragile offering. Adrian felt a warmth spread through him, a strange blend of relief and a renewed concern. Mason looked genuinely lost, more so than Adrian had ever seen him, even after the most harrowing calls. This wasn't the kind of weariness that sleep could fix. It was a deeper, more profound disorientation. Just then, Adrian's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, seeing Chloe's name flash across the screen. He glanced at Mason, who was now leaning against the wall, eyes closed. "It's Chloe," Adrian murmured, mostly to himself. Mason opened his eyes, a flicker of something unreadable passing through them. "Go ahead." Adrian stepped into the kitchen, keeping his voice low. "Hey, Chloe." "Adrian, there you are." Chloe's voice, bright and energetic, even through the phone, cut through the quiet of the house. "I had a feeling, like a strong, undeniable gut feeling. Something shifted, hasn't it? I could practically taste the change in your aura, darling." Adrian chuckled, a genuine, albeit soft sound. "My aura. Don't mock my intuition. It's never wrong. You sound different. Lighter, but also fraught. Did something happen? Is he back?" Her questions tumbled out, rapid fire, her intuitive senses clearly tingling. Adrian hesitated, glancing towards the hallway where Mason still stood. He hadn't told Chloe much about Mason's nightly visits, only vague mentions of a friend needing a place to crash. Now, with Mason's return, the unspoken elements of their strange dynamic felt more pronounced. "He's back," Adrian confirmed, the words carrying more weight than he intended. Chloe hummed, a knowing sound. Knew it. Tell me everything, and don't leave out the dramatic bits. You know I live for those. She paused, her tone shifting slightly. He looks worse, doesn't he? More vulnerable? Adrian's breath hitched. How could she know? He does, Adrian admitted, the admission tasting like truth. He said he missed the quiet. A beat of silence from Chloe's end. Ah, the quiet. That's a powerful thing, Adrian, especially for someone running from the noise inside their own head. This is good. Or it's going to be very, very complicated. Maybe both. She laughed, a bright, encouraging sound. Keep me posted, darling. And remember, sometimes the biggest revelations hide in the quietest moments. Adrian promised to call her later, ending the conversation with a new layer of thought to sift through. He walked back into the hallway. Mason was still there, his eyes now open, watching Adrian. The silence between them felt different this time, not just the absence of sound, but a pregnant pause, heavy with unspoken things. Adrian felt a shift within himself, a quiet certainty blooming. This wasn't just about comfort anymore. It was about something deeper, something that had been simmering beneath the surface, finally threatening to boil over. Unspoken truths. The familiar creak of the floorboards announced Mason's return, 3 days after he'd vanished. Adrian looked up from the book he hadn't truly been reading, his heart doing a strange little skip. Mason stood in the doorway, a shadow of the man who'd left. His shoulders, usually so broad and confident, seemed to slump, and his eyes, often alight with a restless energy, were hollowed, bloodshot. He looked like he hadn't slept, hadn't eaten, hadn't even truly breathed. The usual sharp lines of his jaw were softened by an exhaustion that permeated his entire being. Adrian, he rasped, his voice rough as if from disuse. Adrian simply nodded, a silent invitation to enter the quiet sanctuary of the living room. Mason hesitated for a moment, then shuffled in, moving with a weary grace to the worn armchair opposite Adrian. But he didn't sit. Instead, he dropped to the floor, leaning against the armrest, closer than he usually would, his head bowed. The air, usually charged with an unspoken tension when Mason was present, felt thick with something else now. A vulnerability so raw it was almost palpable. Adrian closed his book, placing it carefully on the small side table. He didn't speak, knowing Mason would in his own time. The silence stretched, not uncomfortable, but pregnant with unspoken words. Mason finally stirred, his gaze fixed on the frayed pattern of the rug. I missed you, he confessed, the words barely a whisper, yet they resonated in the quiet room. He shifted, his knee brushing Adrian's leg as he settled more comfortably on the floor. It was weird. Like a constant ache in my chest. I kept thinking of this place, of you. He finally looked up, his eyes meeting Adrian's, a flicker of something unreadable passing between them. It's a strange feeling to miss someone that much. I didn't know what to do with it. Adrian remained still, a steady presence, a silent anchor in Mason's storm. He felt a burgeoning warmth in his own chest. A mixture of relief and a new, bewildering concern. Mason's honesty was disarming, a stark contrast to his usual guardedness. Mason took a deep, shuddering breath. I tried to stay away, he admitted, his voice gaining a little more strength, though it was still tinged with shame. These feelings, they're new, and they scared the hell out of me. I don't understand them. I don't understand this. He gestured vaguely between them, his hand trembling slightly. It's different from anything I've ever felt. It's not logical, and it just kept building. He paused, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. I thought if I just cut myself off, it would go away, that I could just reset, but it didn't work. The more I tried to distance myself, the louder your absence became. Every patrol, every quiet moment at home, it was all filled with you. I kept replaying our conversations, the way you listen, the way you just are. He finally looked directly at Adrian, his eyes pleading for understanding. I couldn't stop thinking about you. It was a constant hum beneath everything else, an echo I couldn't silence. The raw vulnerability in Mason's voice was a punch to Adrian's gut, stirring a protectiveness he hadn't realized he possessed. He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before gently resting on Mason's shoulder. The touch was tentative, yet firm, a silent reassurance. Mason leaned into it, his eyes closing for a brief moment as if finding solace in the simple contact. The air hummed with the weight of unspoken truths, finally given voice. A quiet confession. Adrian sat by the window, the old leather armchair creaking softly as he shifted. 3 days had passed since Mason had abruptly left, leaving behind a void that had grown steadily larger with each tick of the grandfather clock in the hall. The silence in the apartment, once a comforting companion, now felt heavy, punctuated only by the distant hum of city traffic. He had tried to distract himself, reading, sketching, even attempting to bake, a rare foray into the culinary arts. But Mason's absence had been a persistent ache. Then, the familiar knock, softer this time, almost hesitant. Adrian's heart, which had been performing a slow, steady rhythm, quickened, a sudden flutter beneath his ribs. He rose, the movement fluid and unhurried, though an inner urgency propelled him towards the door. Mason stood on the threshold, looking utterly depleted. His usually impeccable uniform was rumpled, the creases gone, and a faint shadow of stubble dusted his jawline. His eyes, normally sharp and watchful, were clouded with a deep weariness, ringed with dark smudges that spoke of sleepless nights. He looked at Adrian, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze. Apology, relief, fear. Adrian. Mason's voice was hoarse, a whisper against the quiet night. Can I come in? Adrian simply stepped aside, the unspoken invitation hanging in the air. Mason entered, moving slowly, as if each step required immense effort. He didn't head for the couch or the kitchen as he usually would. Instead, he stopped in the middle of the living room, his shoulders slumped. The air thrummed with an unspoken tension, a fragile stillness that Adrian was careful not to break. He watched Mason, his own breathing shallow, waiting. Mason took a deep, shuddering breath, his chest rising and falling visibly. He ran a hand over his face, scrubbing at his tired eyes as if trying to wipe away the exhaustion etched there. When he lowered his hand, his gaze found Adrian's, direct and unwavering despite the vulnerability that now clouded them. I'm sorry, Mason began, his voice still rough but gaining a little strength, for just leaving like that. Everything it got to be too much. I needed to think, to be alone. He paused, searching Adrian's face, as if seeking some reassurance, some sign of understanding. Adrian offered nothing but his quiet presence, a steady anchor in Mason's storm. The past few days, they've been hell, Mason continued, his voice dropping to a near murmur. Out there, everything feels wrong, disconnected. I couldn't focus. My head was a mess. He clenched his fists at his sides, then relaxed them, a restless energy vibrating beneath his weary facade. And every night I kept thinking about this place, about you. Adrian felt a warmth spread through his chest, a soft, blossoming sensation that eased the chill of Mason's absence. He maintained his patient silence, knowing Mason needed to speak, to unravel whatever tangle of emotions had brought him to this point. His heart continued its faster rhythm, a drumbeat of anticipation. Mason took another deep breath, his gaze fixed on Adrian's. The air seemed to thicken, charged with unspoken words, with the weight of raw feeling. "I missed you, Adrian," he confessed, the words almost tripping over each other. "More than I should have. More than I thought was possible." A muscle in his jaw twitched. And being away, it just made everything clearer, everything I've been trying to ignore. He swallowed hard, his eyes earnest, vulnerable. "I've been so confused, so angry at myself for feeling things I shouldn't, things I never expected." He took another slow breath, gathering his courage, his gaze never leaving Adrian's. "But I can't fight it anymore. I don't want to. Adrian, Mason's voice cracked slightly, but he pushed through it, a desperate honesty shining in his tired eyes. "I'm in love with you." The words hung in the air, resonant and true. Adrian felt a rush of emotion, a wave of relief washing over him, mingled with a profound sense of rightness. The quiet anticipation that had held him captive finally released its grip. He took a step forward, then another, closing the small distance between them. A gentle smile touched Adrian's lips, a warmth radiating from his eyes. He reached out, his hand finding Mason's. His fingers curled around Mason's, a soft, comforting pressure. Mason's hand was cool to the touch, slightly trembling, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he gripped Adrian's hand, a silent acknowledgement, a desperate anchor. In that quiet moment, a profound understanding settled between them. No grand declarations were needed, no elaborate promises. Just the soft press of Adrian's hand in Mason's, a gentle, unwavering acceptance. It was a silent conversation, a quiet confession reciprocated, solidifying a connection that had been growing in the shadows, finally brought into the light. Mason's shoulders relaxed, a heavy burden visibly lifting from him, and he leaned into Adrian's touch, a man finally home.